The smoke had barely cleared from Pearl Harbor when the question consumed Washington: who would lead America's shattered Pacific Fleet back from the edge of annihilation? December 7, 1941, had not merely destroyed battleships and aircraft, it had shattered the illusion of American naval invincibility. In the wreckage of that Sunday morning, as oil fires still burned across the harbor and bodies floated among the twisted metal, the United States Navy faced a crisis that transcended tactical defeat. This was a psychological catastrophe, an institutional humiliation that demanded not just reconstruction, but resurrection. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood something fundamental about warfare that his advisors were only beginning to grasp. Battles are won with steel and strategy, but wars are won with will. And will, in its purest form, requires leadership that can transform despair into determination, chaos into calculated aggression. The man who would command the Pacific Fleet needed to be more than a competent administrator or a tactical genius. He needed to be a psychological architect, capable of rebuilding an entire fleet's shattered confidence, while simultaneously planning the most audacious naval campaign in human history. But Roosevelt's choice would not be obvious. In fact, it would be shocking. The conventional wisdom pointed towards several candidates, each with impeccable credentials and powerful supporters within the Navy's Byzantine hierarchy. There were the battleship admirals, men who had spent decades worshiping at the altar of big guns and heavy armor, convinced that capital ships remained the ultimate arbiters of naval supremacy. There were the aviation enthusiasts, a younger generation who had witnessed the devastation wrought by Japanese carrier aircraft and understood that the future of naval warfare had fundamentally shifted. And there were the political animals, officers who had mastered the delicate art of navigating Washington's corridors of power, men who knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to innovate and when to conform. None of them would get the job. Instead, Roosevelt would select a man who represented everything the Navy establishment had learned to distrust, a man whose career had been marked by controversy, insubordination, and a relentless willingness to challenge sacred assumptions, a man who had made enemies among the most powerful officers in the fleet, who had been passed over for promotions, sidelined into administrative backwaters, and marked as temperamentally unsuitable for high command. A man whose aggressive instincts and emotional volatility had earned him a reputation as brilliant but dangerous, visionary but unstable. His name was William Frederick Halsey, Jr., though the fleet knew him simply as Bull. To understand why Roosevelt chose Halsey, and why that choice would prove both inspired and catastrophic, requires understanding the psychology of naval warfare in 1941, the institutional culture of the United States Navy, and the specific character traits that Roosevelt believed essential for the grinding, brutal campaign that lay ahead. The president was not looking for perfection, he was looking for ferocity. He was not seeking a diplomat, he was seeking a warrior who could channel the rage and humiliation of Pearl Harbor into offensive action, who could convince shell-shocked sailors that they were hunters rather than prey. But Halsey's path to command had been anything but straightforward. Born in 1882 to a naval family in Elizabeth, New Jersey, he had entered Annapolis with the entitled confidence of military aristocracy and graduated in 1904, 13th in a class of 62, respectable but unremarkable. His early career followed the predictable trajectory of a competent but conventional officer: destroyer commands, staff positions, the slow accumulation of experience and seniority that characterized peacetime naval service. Nothing in his record suggested exceptional promise or indicated that he would one day command millions of men in the largest naval battles ever fought. What set Halsey apart, what would eventually make him both indispensable and dangerous, was his psychological makeup. He possessed an almost pathological need for action, an inability to tolerate inactivity or defensive postures that bordered on compulsion. Where other officers saw complexity and ambiguity, Halsey saw clarity and opportunity. Where others counseled caution and preparation, Halsey demanded immediate offensive operations. This was not strategic brilliance. Halsey's tactical acumen was often questionable, his understanding of complex operational planning limited. This was something more primal, an emotional orientation toward warfare that prioritized aggression over calculation, momentum over prudence, psychological impact over tactical efficiency. The Navy's leadership recognized this quality in Halsey, and they distrusted it profoundly. The institutional culture of the interwar Navy valued intellectualism, careful planning, and adherence to established doctrine. Officers advanced by demonstrating mastery of technical details, by producing thoughtful staff studies, by showing deference to seniority and respect for traditional methods. Halsey embodied men of these virtues.
He was intellectually lazy, strategically unsophisticated, and temperamentally incapable of the kind of careful, methodical approach that characterized successful staff work. His reports were brief to the point of dismissiveness, his planning sessions confrontational, his leadership style built around emotional inspiration rather than systematic organization. By the late 1930s, Halsey's career appeared to have plateaued. He had reached flag rank, 1 star, Rear Admiral, but his prospects for further advancement seemed limited. Younger officers with better political connections and more refined intellectual credentials were being groomed for the Navy's highest positions. Halsey found himself assigned to Carrier Command, a backwater assignment in a Navy that still considered battleships the measure of naval power. Aircraft carriers were auxiliary vessels, useful for scouting and supporting the battle line, but fundamentally secondary to the capital ships that would decide the great fleet engagements. But this assignment, intended as a professional dead end, would prove to be Halsey's salvation.
The aircraft carrier assignment that was meant to sideline William Halsey instead transformed him into exactly the kind of commander Franklin Roosevelt would need when the world caught fire. Between 1935 and 1941, as Halsey commanded carrier divisions and absorbed the revolutionary possibilities of naval aviation, he underwent a conversion that was less intellectual than instinctive. He did not study carrier warfare with the systematic rigor of a tactical theorist. Instead, he felt its potential in his bones, recognized in the speed and striking power of carrier aircraft something that resonated with his own psychological need for aggressive, offensive action. This was not the careful, methodical embrace of new technology that characterized officers like Raymond Spruance or Chester Nimitz. Halsey's enthusiasm for carriers came from a more visceral place. They allowed him to strike first, to attack rather than wait, to impose his will on the enemy rather than react to enemy initiatives. The carrier embodied everything Halsey believed about warfare, that audacity trumped caution, that psychological impact mattered as much as tactical efficiency, that the side which seized and maintained the initiative would ultimately prevail, regardless of material balance or strategic sophistication. But even as Halsey developed into one of the Navy's few true believers in carrier aviation, his reputation within the service remained deeply problematic. Senior officers who served with him described a man of extreme emotional volatility, capable of inspiring loyalty and determination in his subordinates, but equally capable of reckless decision-making when his aggressive instincts overwhelmed his limited strategic judgment. Staff officers found him frustrating to work with, dismissive of careful planning, impatient with detailed operational analysis. He wanted action, not paperwork. He wanted to attack, not to study the problem. Admiral Ernest King, who would become Chief of Naval Operations and one of the most powerful figures in the American war effort, had known Halsey for decades and harbored serious reservations about his fitness for high command. King recognized Halsey's value as a tactical commander, someone who could execute offensive operations with determination and inspire sailors to extraordinary efforts. But King also understood Halsey's limitations, his strategic myopia, his emotional decision-making, his tendency to see every problem as requiring an immediate aggressive response. In King's calculating assessment, Halsey was a useful weapon, but a potentially dangerous one, capable of achieving remarkable victories, but equally capable of catastrophic defeats if not carefully controlled. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would command the Pacific Theater, shared King's ambivalence. Nimitz had served with Halsey in various capacities and appreciated his fighting spirit and leadership qualities. But Nimitz was also aware of the risks inherent in giving Halsey independent command of major fleet units. Halsey's decision-making under pressure was unpredictable. His understanding of complex operational planning was superficial. His ability to coordinate multi-layered campaigns involving diverse forces operating across vast distances was unproven. Nimitz wanted aggressive commanders, but he also needed officers who could think systematically, who could balance competing priorities, who could subordinate their emotional impulses to strategic necessity. Neither King nor Nimitz would have recommended Halsey for command of the Pacific Fleet in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The conventional choice would have been someone more intellectually sophisticated, more emotionally stable, more capable of the kind of careful reconstruction and methodical planning that the situation seemed to demand. Officers like Raymond Spruance or Richmond Kelly Turner possessed the analytical skills and temperamental steadiness that appeared essential for the monumental challenge ahead. But Franklin Roosevelt was not looking for conventional qualities. He was looking for something else entirely. Roosevelt understood the American psyche in ways that his military advisors, for all their tactical and strategic expertise, did not fully grasp. The president recognized that Pearl Harbor had inflicted a psychological wound that transcended military calculation. Americans were not merely shocked by the attack,
They were humiliated, enraged, desperate for proof that their military could strike back, that the devastating surprise attack did not represent some fundamental superiority of Japanese arms or Japanese will. The nation needed visible, aggressive action, needed to see American forces attacking rather than defending, needed psychological reassurance that the war was not already lost. Roosevelt also understood something about the nature of the Pacific War that would prove prophetic. This would not be a campaign decided by careful, methodical strategy alone. The vast distances, the logistical nightmares, the amphibious operations across thousands of miles of ocean, all of this would require not just planning, but relentless, grinding aggression. The side that maintained defensive momentum, that kept attacking regardless of setbacks, that refused to be paralyzed by the enormity of the strategic challenge, would ultimately prevail. Roosevelt needed commanders who embodied this offensive spirit, who would attack even when the odds seemed unfavorable, who would take risks that more cautious officers would reject. And there was another factor, one that Roosevelt recognized intuitively, the importance of myth-making in modern warfare. The president understood that wars were fought not just on battlefields, but in newspapers, in newsreels, in the collective imagination of the American people. He needed commanders who could become symbols, whose personalities could capture public attention and sustain morale through what would inevitably be years of brutal, costly fighting. Halsey, with his aggressive reputation and colorful personality, was perfect for this role. He could become the embodiment of American fighting spirit, the admiral who never backed down, who always attacked, who personified the nation's determination to achieve total victory. When Admiral Husband Kimmel was relieved of command following Pearl Harbor, the decision about his replacement fell to Roosevelt with input from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Admiral King. The institutional Navy recommended Admiral Chester Nimitz, a safe choice who combined strategic sophistication with steady leadership and broad respect within the service. Nimitz would indeed receive the Pacific Command, taking charge of the entire theater. But for carrier operations, for the offensive strikes that would demonstrate American resolve and capability, Roosevelt wanted Halsey. The decision shocked many within the Navy's hierarchy. Halsey had not been groomed for this level of responsibility. He lacked the political connections, the intellectual credentials, the carefully cultivated relationships with Washington power brokers that typically preceded such appointments. More troubling, his emotional volatility and strategic limitations were well known among senior officers. Elevating him to command of carrier task forces responsible for America's offensive operations in the Pacific was a gamble, one that could yield spectacular results or catastrophic failures. But Roosevelt was willing to take that gamble because he understood what the moment required. Not caution, but audacity. Not careful planning, but immediate action. Not defensive strategy, but offensive psychology. Halsey embodied the spirit Roosevelt believed essential for the campaign ahead, even if that spirit came packaged with significant risks.
The initial test of Roosevelt's gamble came swiftly, and it would validate the president's instincts while simultaneously revealing the profound dangers inherent in Halsey's command style. In the months following Pearl Harbor, as the Japanese Empire expanded across the Pacific with terrifying speed, capturing Wake Island, overwhelming the Philippines, pushing deep into Southeast Asia, and threatening Australia itself, the American public demanded action. The Navy's battleship fleet lay crippled in Hawaiian waters, ground forces were retreating everywhere. The psychological momentum belonged entirely to Japan, and that momentum was crushing American morale with each passing week. Halsey received command of Task Force 8, centered on the carrier USS Enterprise, with orders to conduct offensive operations against Japanese positions. The strategic value of these early raids was minimal, small-scale attacks on isolated outposts that could not significantly alter the balance of power in the Pacific, but their psychological value was incalculable. Roosevelt and Admiral King understood that America needed visible proof of offensive capability, needed to see its military striking back, needed psychological reassurance that the war was not a one-sided catastrophe, and Halsey delivered exactly what Roosevelt had hoped for. In February 1942, Task Force 8 struck Japanese installations in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. The attacks achieved limited tactical results, some damaged facilities, a few destroyed aircraft, but the propaganda impact was enormous. American newspapers trumpeted the raids as proof of American fighting spirit. Halsey became an instant hero, the aggressive admiral who was taking the fight to the enemy while others counseled caution and reconstruction. His language in press releases and communications perfectly captured the vengeful mood Roosevelt wanted to cultivate. Promises to hit hard and hit often, declarations that the Navy would make Japan pay in blood for Pearl Harbor, defiant assertions that American forces would carry the offensive across the Pacific regardless of cost. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, and Halsey proved to be a natural propagandist.
His rough-hewn persona, his profanity-laced communications, his evident contempt for defensive thinking, all of this resonated powerfully with an American public desperate for aggressive leadership. Where other admirals spoke in careful, measured tones about the long-term challenges of Pacific warfare, Halsey spoke in visceral, emotional terms about revenge and victory. Where others emphasized the need for patience and preparation, Halsey promised immediate action and relentless offense. Roosevelt watched this psychological transformation with satisfaction. He had chosen Halsey not despite his emotional volatility, but because of it, recognizing that the admiral's aggressive instincts and propagandistic value outweighed his strategic limitations. The early carrier raids accomplished little in strictly military terms, but they achieved something far more important. They restored American confidence and created a narrative of aggressive response that would sustain public morale through the difficult months ahead. But these same qualities that made Halsey invaluable for psychological warfare also made him dangerous in actual combat operations requiring sophisticated judgment and tactical restraint. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 illustrated both Halsey's strengths and his limitations with stark clarity. Task Force 18, with Halsey in command, transported 16 B-25 bombers to within striking range of Tokyo, launching the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands. The raid was a propaganda masterpiece, demonstrating that Japan was vulnerable and that American forces could strike at the heart of the empire. Halsey's aggressive leadership and willingness to accept significant risk made the operation possible. Yet the raid also revealed troubling aspects of Halsey's decision-making. When Japanese patrol vessels detected the task force earlier than planned, forcing the bombers to launch from greater distance than intended, Halsey's response was characteristically aggressive but strategically questionable. Rather than aborting the mission or adjusting the operation to minimize risk, he pushed forward, accepting that the early launch would mean the bombers could not return to the carriers and would have to attempt landings in China with insufficient fuel. The decision maximized propaganda impact but sacrificed the aircraft and endangered the crews, a trade-off that revealed Halsey's fundamental orientation towards psychological effect over tactical efficiency. Admiral Spruance, observing Halsey's command style during this period, noted with concern the emotional basis of many of his decisions. Halsey did not systematically weigh options, carefully analyze intelligence, or methodically consider alternatives. Instead, he operated on instinct and aggression, making rapid decisions that prioritized offensive action over careful calculation. This approach could yield bold and decisive results, but it could also lead to catastrophic errors when the situation required subtlety, patience, or tactical sophistication. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 should have been Halsey's defining moment, the engagement where his aggressive leadership would turn the tide of the Pacific War. But fate intervened in ways that would profoundly shape the subsequent course of the campaign. Days before the battle, Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition, physically and mentally exhausted from months of continuous operations. His absence from the most critical naval battle of the war was devastating to his ego and his reputation within the Navy, but it may have been strategically fortunate for the United States. In Halsey's place, Admiral Nimitz appointed Raymond Spruance to command the carrier task force at Midway. Spruance represented everything Halsey was not: intellectually rigorous, emotionally controlled, strategically sophisticated, willing to subordinate aggressive instincts to tactical necessity. Where Halsey would have pursued the retreating Japanese fleet with relentless aggression, potentially exposing American carriers to counterattack, Spruance calculated the risks and withdrew at the optimal moment, securing a decisive victory with unnecessary losses. The contrast was instructive and deeply troubling for those who understood its implications. Midway demonstrated that aggressive leadership, while psychologically valuable and tactically useful in certain circumstances, was not sufficient for the complex operational challenges of modern naval warfare. The battle required careful intelligence analysis, sophisticated coordination of multiple task forces, precise timing, and most critically, the discipline to know when to press an advantage and when to consolidate gains. These were not Halsey's strengths. His absence from Midway was lamented by the public and the press, who saw him as the embodiment of fighting spirit, but senior naval officers recognized that Spruance's more measured approach had been essential to the magnitude of the victory. Yet Roosevelt and Admiral King could not afford to sideline Halsey despite these revelations about his limitations. The propaganda value of his aggressive persona remained immense. American morale still required visible symbols of offensive determination, and there were operational contexts where Halsey's particular combination of audacity and inspirational leadership made him uniquely valuable. The question was not whether to use Halsey, but how to deploy him in ways that maximized his strengths while minimizing the risks inherent in his emotional decision-making and strategic myopia. The solution would be the South Pacific Command, a theater where aggressive leadership and relentless offensive spirit mattered more than sophisticated operational planning, where the grinding, attritional nature of the campaign required the kind of emotional resilience and psychological fortitude that Halsey embodied.
In October 1942, as the Guadalcanal campaign descended into a brutal stalemate that threatened to become America's first major defeat of the Pacific War, Admiral Nimitz made a decision that would validate Roosevelt's initial gamble while simultaneously revealing the catastrophic costs of Halsey's command philosophy. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, the cautious and increasingly pessimistic commander of the South Pacific area, was relieved and replaced by William Halsey. The appointment was vintage Roosevelt psychology. When faced with a grinding, attritional campaign that was sapping American morale and threatening strategic collapse, send in the aggressive commander who promises offensive action regardless of odds. Halsey arrived in the South Pacific to find a nightmare scenario. American forces on Guadalcanal were besieged, outnumbered, and on the verge of collapse. Japanese naval forces controlled the waters around the island, reinforcing their troops nightly in operations the Americans grimly called the Tokyo Express. American sailors were exhausted, their ships battered from months of continuous combat in the confined waters around the Solomon Islands. The logistical situation was desperate. Intelligence suggested major Japanese offensives were imminent. The entire campaign appeared to be sliding toward disaster. Gormley had responded to this crisis with increasing caution, hoarding resources, requesting reinforcements, warning Washington that the situation might be untenable. His communications radiated defeatism, a psychological contagion that was spreading through the command structure and undermining the determination essential for the grinding fight ahead. Nimitz recognized that the South Pacific needed not more resources, but different psychology. The campaign required a commander who would attack rather than defend, who would inspire rather than caution, who would convince desperate men that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. Halsey transformed the psychological climate of the South Pacific Command within hours of his arrival. His first message to the fleet became legendary: strike, repeat, strike. No careful analysis of strategic alternatives, no methodical review of logistical constraints, no cautious assessment of relative force balances, just the simple, aggressive directive that embodied everything Halsey represented: attack, always attack, regardless of circumstances. The message electrified exhausted sailors and Marines who had begun to doubt whether their leadership possessed the will to win. And the approach worked, at least initially. Halsey's aggressive posture and inspirational leadership did exactly what Roosevelt had anticipated. It restored fighting spirit, convinced desperate men that they were engaged in a winnable fight, and transformed the psychological momentum of the campaign. American forces at Guadalcanal, energized by Halsey's uncompromising offensive spirit, fought with renewed determination. Naval commanders who had been hoarding resources and avoiding risk began conducting more aggressive operations. The entire tenor of the campaign shifted from defensive desperation to offensive determination. But this psychological transformation came at a terrible cost, one that revealed the dark underside of Halsey's command philosophy. In November 1942, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Halsey's aggressive directives led to a series of chaotic night engagements that resulted in catastrophic American losses. Inadequately prepared American task forces, pushed forward by Halsey's relentless demands for offensive action, stumbled into savage close-range battles against superior Japanese forces. The cruiser Juno was sunk with massive loss of life, including all 5 Sullivan brothers in one of the war's most devastating single-family tragedies. Multiple destroyers were lost. The battleship South Dakota was heavily damaged. American casualties were staggering. Yet Halsey's response to these losses was characteristically aggressive. Order more attacks, maintain offensive pressure, accept casualties as the inevitable cost of winning. This was the essence of Halsey's philosophy: victory through relentless aggression, regardless of tactical efficiency or casualty rates. In the attritional mathematics of the Guadalcanal campaign, where psychological determination mattered as much as tactical sophistication, this approach achieved its objective. American forces maintained offensive momentum, Japanese reinforcement efforts were disrupted, and the strategic initiative gradually shifted to the United States. But senior Navy officers watching from Pearl Harbor and Washington recognized the unsustainable nature of Halsey's methods. Admiral Spruance, reviewing the battle reports from Guadalcanal, noted with alarm the tactical chaos and unnecessary losses that characterized Halsey's operations.
Admiral King, while publicly supporting Halsey's aggressive approach, privately questioned whether the costs were justified by the results. The victory at Guadalcanal was real, but it had been achieved through brute force and sacrifice, rather than through the kind of sophisticated operational planning that characterized successful campaigns elsewhere in the Pacific. As the war progressed into 1943 and 1944, the limitations of Halsey's command style became increasingly apparent and increasingly dangerous. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Halsey's emotional decision-making and strategic myopia nearly resulted in catastrophic American defeat. Lured north by a Japanese decoy carrier force, Halsey abandoned his primary mission of protecting the invasion fleet, leaving the vulnerable amphibious forces exposed to Japanese battleships. Only desperate fighting by outgunned American escort carriers and destroyers, and Halsey's belated reversal of his decision, prevented disaster. The episode revealed that Halsey's aggressive instincts, so valuable for maintaining offensive momentum and inspiring fighting spirit, could become actively dangerous when sophisticated strategic judgment was required. Yet Roosevelt's original calculation had been validated in ways that transcended tactical success or failure. Halsey had become exactly what the president needed, a symbol of American fighting spirit, a propaganda figure who embodied the nation's determination to achieve total victory, a commander whose very presence communicated aggressive intent and psychological dominance. American newspapers lionized him. War bond drives featured his image. His profundity-laced declarations of intent to destroy Japan became cultural touchstones, repeated and celebrated across the country. He was Bull Halsey, the admiral who never backed down, who always attacked, who personified American martial determination. This was Roosevelt's genius, recognizing that modern warfare required not just tactical competence, but psychological architecture, that sustaining civilian morale and military determination through years of brutal fighting required commanders who could function as symbols as much as strategists. Halsey's tactical limitations and emotional volatility were real and significant, but they were outweighed by his psychological value, his ability to convince millions of Americans and hundreds of thousands of sailors that victory was certain, that offensive action would prevail, that American will was unbreakable. When the war ended in August 1945, Halsey stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay as Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. The symbolism was perfect. The aggressive admiral who had promised to make Japan pay in blood, who had embodied American fighting spirit from the dark days after Pearl Harbor through the final victory, present at the culmination of the campaign he had helped sustain through sheer force of will and relentless offensive determination. Roosevelt had not lived to see this moment. He had died in April 1945, but his choice of Halsey had been vindicated in the only way that ultimately mattered: total victory. The unwanted admiral, the officer whose career had appeared stalled, whose emotional volatility had marked him as unsuitable for high command, whose strategic limitations were recognized by every senior officer in the Navy, had become indispensable precisely because of the qualities that made him problematic. Roosevelt had understood what others had not, that winning the Pacific War required not perfect commanders, but commanders with the specific psychological qualities necessary for the specific challenges ahead. Halsey's aggression, his emotional intensity, his propaganda value, his inspirational leadership, these outweighed his tactical deficiencies and strategic myopia because the nature of the campaign rewarded relentless offensive spirit more than sophisticated operational planning. This was the dark truth at the heart of Halsey's ascension. Sometimes wars are won not by the best commanders, but by the commanders whose particular pathologies align with the specific psychological demands of the moment. Roosevelt had gambled on Halsey's aggression, and that gamble had paid off in victory, even as it had cost thousands of lives in unnecessary tactical defeats and strategic errors. The unwanted admiral had become indispensable, not despite his flaws, but because his flaws were precisely what the moment required.